This book is dedicated to the countless unsung heroes of the medieval postal service, those tireless souls who braved plague, bandits, and the sheer ineptitude of their employers to deliver messages across treacherous landscapes. To the messengers whose names are lost to history, whose only legacy is a slightly damp parchment tucked away in some forgotten archive. This one's for you. May your afterlife be filled with endlessly flowing ale, perfectly roasted boar, and the blissful absence of rain soaked mailbags. May your journeys be shorter, your horses faster, and your recipients less likely to accuse you of witchcraft simply because your delivery was, shall we say, slightly delayed. Seriously, those handwritten letters were nearly impossible to decipher. Imagine trying to decipher a rushed, quill stained scrawl in the fading light of a medieval lamp, only to find out the entire message was a hastily scribbled shopping list that began and ended with the word more ale. The sheer audacity, the unmitigated nerve. These poor messengers deserve sainthood and possibly a hefty pay raise, retroactive to the year 1066, or whenever they started this maddeningly underpaid gig. To the scholars who've painstakingly pieced together the fragments of their existence, to the archivists who have dusted off the forgotten scrolls, to the historians who've dared to imagine the daily struggles of these often overlooked figures, this is a small attempt to pay tribute to your dedication. I would also like to extend a humble dedication to my own postal carrier, whose patience knows no bounds, and whose consistent, reliable service is a stark contrast to the unreliable, often life-threatening world portrayed in this novel. In contrast to our medieval heroes, my letter carrier doesn't have to contend with marauding wolves, as far as I know, collapsing bridges, or recipients who blame delayed deliveries on demonic interference. May your days be filled with sunshine, well-behaved canines, and the timely delivery of Amazon packages. I truly feel a book like this would not be possible without the countless hours spent reviewing history documents, so I must offer a particular thank you to those who maintain historical integrity across the ages. Finally, this book is dedicated to anyone who has ever had a job they secretly hated but felt powerless to quit, especially if that job involved trekking across bogs, dodging flying livestock, and trying to explain away a mysteriously missing shipment of royal cutlery to a particularly grumpy king. You know who you are, and you have my deepest, most empathetic sympathy, and maybe a stiff drink, or 20. Chapter 1. The Scourge of the 7 Shillings. The rain hammered against the thatch roof of the ramshackle inn, a rhythm only slightly less monotonous than the incessant drip, drip, drip from a perpetually leaky bucket in the corner. Thomas, our hero, or perhaps more accurately, our perpetually soggy anti-hero, sighed, a sound like air escaping a punctured lung. 7 shillings. That's what he'd been paid for the last agonizing month, a sum barely enough to cover the escalating cost of ale, a necessity, not a luxury, given the sheer volume of existential dread he had to numb on a daily basis. 7 shillings, and a rapidly dwindling supply of slightly moldy bread. The lord of the manor, bless his avaricious heart, had recently implemented a new tax on, well, on everything apparently. Even the air seemed taxed these days. Thomas suspected it was a tax on breathing, or perhaps the sheer audacity of existing in his presence. He'd now owed more than he'd earned in the last 3 months. He meticulously checked his meager supplies. 3 slightly squashed loaves of bread, exhibiting a concerning degree of green fuzz, a half-empty water skin, smelling faintly of swamp and despair, a pouch of 7 suspiciously damp shillings, clinging together like drowning kittens, and a rather battered map, more holes than parchment at this point. He patted the pouch, a gesture more of mournful farewell than of hopeful reassurance. It felt less like a financial reserve and more like a symbolic representation of his rapidly diminishing life force. The wolves, notoriously emboldened by the recent increase in taxes, apparently even they couldn't escape the Lord's grasping fingers, had become a serious threat. He'd heard tales of entire caravans being devoured, leaving behind only a scattering of scattered bones and the faint smell of regret. His boots, thick with mud and the lingering scent of something suspiciously bovine, were the only reliable asset he owned. He ran a calloused thumb over the cracked leather, a familiar comfort in this sea of misery. He wondered, not for the first time, about the sheer absurdity of it all. Here he was, a man of refined intellect, at least he liked to think so, reduced to traipsing through mud and risking life and limb for a pittance. He could almost feel the weight of 1,000 years of human history pressing down on his shoulders, particularly the weight of those years spent manually delivering messages instead of just texting them to the recipient. The contrast was striking, almost painful. He envisioned himself in a comfortable chair, feet propped up, effortlessly dispatching missives with a few swift taps on a glowing rectangular device. Instantaneous communication, no muddy roads, no hungry wolves, no grasping lords demanding yet another ludicrous tax. It would also spare him the humiliation of having to listen to the endless complaints of the recipients, who always seemed to find fault in something. The ink, the paper, the handwriting, the fact that he dared to bother them during supper. There always seemed to be something to find fault in. He wasn't even sure if delivering the message correctly was part of the job description anymore. He adjusted the heavy satchel on his shoulder, the weight of it a constant reminder of his predicament. The parchment within crinkled, whispering promises of untold hardships. This was his life, a relentless cycle of rain-soaked trails, dubious innkeepers, and the ever-present threat of both natural and man-made disasters. He considered for a moment the possibility of abandoning the job altogether, finding a quieter life, possibly as a shepherd. At least sheep, unlike humans, generally didn't complain about the quality of the messaging system. But then the bleak reality of his current financial state hit him again. 7 shillings hardly covered the cost of a decent shepherd's crook, let alone the rent on a humble hut. He took a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation filling his lungs. This was his life, or at least his current iteration of it. He would continue his miserable existence as a messenger, soldiering on through the muck and mire of the medieval world, finding what little humor he could in the absurd and the downright dangerous. He adjusted his pack once more, muttering a curse at the persistent drizzle and the sheer unfairness of it all. It was a curse punctuated by a sudden, startling realization. He was significantly behind schedule. His latest commission was delivered already 2 weeks overdue. The recipient, Lord Bartholomew Bumblebrook, was known for having the patience of a particularly ravenous badger. The journey ahead was certain to be far more challenging than the previous weeks had been. And just then, as if on cue, a particularly large and disgruntled looking badger strolled across the muddy street, seemingly confirming his worst fears. It gave him a knowing look, then proceeded to relieve itself with unhurried contentment directly next to his boots. Thomas sighed. Another day, another disaster. At least he had his 7 shillings, and perhaps, if he was very lucky, a small piece of moldy bread to look forward to. The adventure, after all, had just begun. The badger, having completed its business with a flourish, ambled off into the mist, leaving Thomas to contemplate the sheer injustice of it all. His boots, already beyond redemption, now bore the added indignity of badger-related biological warfare. He sighed, a sound that carried the weight of centuries of postal woes. 7 shillings, a soggy map, and a rapidly deteriorating pair of boots, his arsenal against the perils of medieval messaging. He shouldered his satchel, the parchment within rustling like the whispers of impending doom. He set off, the muddy track swallowing his boots with alarming ease. The rain, a constant companion, turned the path into a treacherous mire, each step a struggle against the sucking mud and the omnipresent threat of a twisted ankle. He cursed the lack of decent road infrastructure, a complaint echoed by the ruts and potholes that threatened to swallow him whole. He imagined the Romans, those masters of engineering, rolling in their graves at the sorry state of the roads. He wondered for a moment what the Romans would think of texting. Did they have a word for LOL? Perhaps ROLL would have been better suited to their grandiose nature. After what felt like an eternity of slogging through the mud, he stumbled upon a sight that even his hardened heart found unsettling. A village, or rather, what remained of one. Houses stood half collapsed, their thatch roofs sagging like weary shoulders. A pall hung heavy in the air, a miasma of decay and despair. The silence was broken only by the occasional croak of a raven perched ominously on a crumbling wall. He'd heard whispers of the plague, a grim reaper that had swept through the land like a wildfire, leaving behind a trail of death and desolation. This village, it seemed, was a testament to its devastating power. His initial reaction was one of cautious retreat, but then a sudden wave of grim determination washed over him. The message had to be delivered. 7 shillings depended on it, and perhaps even the survival of his already fragile self-esteem. He pressed on, his pace quickening, a strange cocktail of fear and desperation fueling his steps. He imagined Lord Bumblebrook's wrath, a wrath more terrifying than any pestilence. The thought of facing that wrath with an empty pouch and an overdue message was enough to propel him forward, though perhaps not fast enough. He approached the village cautiously, his senses on high alert. He could smell the stench of death, a nauseating mixture of decay and illness, which even the ever-present rain couldn't wash away. He spotted a lone figure, wrapped in rags, staggering through the deserted streets. The figure looked up, and even from a distance he saw its eyes, hollow and feverish. The figure fell. It gave a guttural cry of despair and pain before losing consciousness, before falling silent. Thomas decided to employ what he'd learnt from his years of dodging precarious situations, a strategic bypass. He skirted around the pestilential hamlet, navigating a treacherous path through a swamp that seemed determined to swallow him whole. He was waist deep in murky water, wrestling with slimy reeds, and the unsettling sensation of something large and unidentifiable brushing against his legs. He imagined it could be a variety of things: a swamp monster, a particularly aggressive frog, or perhaps an especially disgruntled badger who had taken a wrong turn. His near death experience in the swamp led to a philosophical moment. He considered the inherent irony of dying in a swamp while carrying a message. It was a level of dramatic irony not even Shakespeare had managed to capture. The thought, perversely, struck him as rather amusing. He chuckled, a sound that quickly turned into a cough as a mouthful of swamp water found its way into his lungs. He spat out the foul concoction, vowing to write a sonnet to the swamp gods, if indeed he survived the experience. After his brush with death by swamp, the crumbling bridge seemed comparatively tame, or so he thought. Half of the bridge had succumbed to the relentless erosion of the river, leaving a terrifying chasm beneath. It had clearly been weakened by recent floods. He approached gingerly, testing each plank with a hesitant foot. Then, with a sickening crack, a large section of the bridge gave way. Thomas found himself teetering precariously, half his body suspended over the raging river, his heart drumming a frantic tattoo against his ribs. But even in his moment of peril, he managed to maintain a shred of dark humor. 7 shillings, he muttered to himself. Not even enough for decent bridge maintenance. He managed to scramble back to safety, his boots covered in a new layer of mud, and something else far less pleasant, something resembling half-digested fish. He reached the other side of the bridge, thoroughly shaken but still alive, though certainly smelling far worse than the swamp itself. His journey continued, a relentless test of endurance and fortitude. He encountered a band of rather jovial bandits who, after a lengthy debate about the finer points of medieval postal services, decided to let him pass in exchange for a rather disturbingly detailed account of his swamp encounter. He finally encountered an old woman, her face etched with the wisdom and weariness of many years spent living in a decidedly unsanitary environment. He made a mental note to write a strongly worded petition to the Lord about sanitation standards. The lack of decent sewage systems and basic hygiene measures were a public health menace. This was a point well taken by the woman, who regaled him with a graphic yet surprisingly hilarious tale of the ongoing battle against dysentery. In short, his journey, much like the medieval postal system, was a chaotic mix of peril, inconvenience, and unexpectedly absurd encounters. It served as a fitting illustration of the challenges of communication in the era before texting, an era where 7 shillings and a pair of sturdy, or at least somewhat sturdy, boots were the most significant assets in his possession. The adventure was far from over. The forest thickened, the trees crowding in like gossiping neighbors, their branches clawing at his worn cloak. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, held a nervous energy. He'd been walking for hours, the sun sinking lower in the sky, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. He was beginning to feel the gnawing pangs of hunger, his stomach rumbling a protest against its empty state. 7 shillings wouldn't buy much, certainly not a hearty meal, perhaps a slightly less moldy loaf of bread, if he was lucky. Then he heard it, a cacophony of shouts, curses, and the clatter of poorly maintained weaponry. A band of bandits, he presumed, though the sounds suggested more a chaotic family squabble than a coordinated ambush. He cautiously approached the source of the commotion, peeking through a curtain of overhanging branches. The sight that greeted him was far from the fearsome band of outlaws he'd envisioned. Instead, a group of men, dressed in mismatched rags and sporting more bruises than actual weapons, were engaged in a furious argument. One, a lanky fellow with a crooked nose and a patch over one eye, was gesticulating wildly, his words lost in the general uproar. Another, a stout man with a surprisingly delicate mustache, was brandishing a rusty spoon as if it were a scimitar. A third, a skinny youth who looked barely old enough to shave, was attempting to hide behind a particularly large oak tree, clearly in a state of profound embarrassment. Their hideout, a dilapidated wagon half hidden amongst the trees, looked more like it had been abandoned in haste rather than strategically positioned. Their argument, as he eventually gleaned from snippets of conversation, centered around the theft of a wheel of cheese. Apparently, the lanky one with the crooked nose had pilfered it from a nearby cheese factory, much to the outrage of the other two. The debate escalated with each passing moment, punctuated by dramatic sighs and the occasional threat of physical violence. Before Thomas could even consider a strategic retreat, one of the bandits spotted him. Well, well, what have we here? The stout man with the delicate mustache announced, his voice booming rather unconvincingly. The rusty spoon was still in his hand. A traveler, Thomas replied, attempting to keep his voice steady despite the tremor in his legs. He considered running, but the bandits were positioned rather strategically, thus making his escape plan rather difficult to execute. A traveler with a rather full satchel, the lanky bandit added, his eye patch twitching suspiciously. And perhaps some spare coins? 7 shillings, Thomas announced, holding up the paltry sum with a theatrical flourish. My entire fortune. The bandits exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed by the amount. A heated debate ensued, louder than before. It seemed the 7 shillings weren't enough to satisfy their hunger or their pride. The skinny youth, who was still hiding behind the tree, groaned loudly in despair, clearly disappointed with the lack of anything remotely valuable in Thomas's possession. Suddenly, the lanky bandit lunged, aiming for Thomas's satchel. Thomas, ever the resourceful messenger, had anticipated this. He sidestepped nimbly, causing the lanky bandit to trip over his own feet. The rusty spoon of the stout bandit flew through the air, narrowly missing Thomas's head and landing harmlessly in the muddy ground. Chaos reigned. The bandits, more accustomed to arguing amongst themselves than engaging in actual combat, stumbled over each other in a hilarious display of incompetence. Thomas, taking advantage of the situation, used his satchel as a makeshift shield, deflecting a shower of badly aimed stones. He dodged, weaved, and employed a series of expertly timed kicks to the shins, each one causing a spectacular display of overreaction and comical yelps of pain. The skinny youth, still attempting to remain hidden, ended up accidentally tripping over the lanky bandit, sending both of them sprawling into a mud puddle. After several minutes of this slapstick battle, the bandits were exhausted and thoroughly demoralized. They lay scattered on the ground, panting and covered in mud. Thomas, despite his own exhaustion, remained remarkably unscathed his 7 shillings still intact. As the dust settled, so the lanky bandit spoke, his voice a mere whisper. Look, we're not really bandits. Oh? Thomas replied, raising an eyebrow. It's a long story. The stout man groaned, wiping mud from his mustache. We were cheesemakers at the local cheese factory. Terrible hours, minimal pay, and the smell. Oh, the smell. We quit, but we're hungry. The skinny youth nodded vigorously. And desperate, he added, emerging from behind the tree, covered in mud and looking utterly miserable. Thomas, surprisingly understanding of their plight, sighed. He knew what it was like to have a thankless job. I understand, he said, reaching into his satchel and pulling out a rather stale-looking bread roll. Here, split this. The 3 bandits cheered, grabbing at the bread with surprising enthusiasm. As they devoured the bread, a debate ensued over who got the bigger piece. The comedic timing of their hunger and the ensuing disagreement made Thomas laugh. He continued his journey, leaving the would-be cheese factory bandits to their post-robbery meal, a little less hungry and a lot more philosophical about their career choices. The encounter, however absurd, was a reminder that even in the brutal reality of the medieval world, there was always room for a little bit of dark, dark humor, and perhaps a shared stale bread roll. The forest floor grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of dying embers. The air, once thick with the scent of damp earth, now carried the sharp, chilling aroma of approaching winter. My stomach, already grumbling its discontent, now added a chorus of growls to the symphony of the darkening woods. 7 shillings, 7 bloody shillings. It was enough, I reckoned, to buy a single, possibly diseased rat from a particularly unscrupulous vendor. Joy. Then I heard it, a low growl, rising and falling like a morbid lullaby. It wasn't the growl of a disgruntled badger or a grumpy bear, or even one of those cheese factory bandits still arguing over the size of their bread rations. This was the low, guttural rumble of something far more carnivorous. Wolves, a pack of them, and judging by the volume, a rather sizable pack. My heart, already weary from the day's misadventures, hammered against my ribs like a frantic blacksmith's apprentice. I cursed my luck, my ill-fated profession, and the very existence of 7-shilling wages. This wasn't in the job description. Nowhere in the infernal scroll of a messenger's duties did it mention facing a pack of hungry wolves in a godforsaken forest. The parchment detailing my responsibilities had omitted a crucial part, which was probably the whole survival bit. I had envisioned being eaten by a particularly vicious badger, not a pack of wolves. My eyes scanned frantically for a way out, for a hiding place, for anything resembling a refuge. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the ever-growing cacophony of wolfish growls. Panic clawed at my throat, threatening to suffocate me. My carefully crafted plan of escaping this mess, involving the strategic use of my trusty satchel as a shield, seemed pathetically inadequate against a pack of wolves. My mind, usually sharp and resourceful, was now as muddled as the brain of the cheese factory bandits. Then I saw it, a small glinting object half hidden under a pile of fallen leaves. A herring, a particularly pungent herring, judging by the lingering aroma that reached my nostrils. An old gift from a particularly inconsiderate acquaintance. The thought of eating it was utterly revolting, but desperate times, desperate measures. With a speed born of pure terror, I snatched the herring and tossed it as far as I could into the gathering darkness. It landed with a pathetic thud, the sound barely audible above the wolves' relentless advance. I clutched my satchel to my chest, waiting for the inevitable. To my utter astonishment, the growls ceased. A moment of stunned silence hung in the air, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart. Then, a chorus of snuffling sounds filled the darkness as the pack focused its attention on the herring. A battle was waged, not between man and beast, but between the wretched herring and the wolves, a clash of pungent scents and desperate hunger. The opportunity was too good to miss. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs like a desperate attempt to swallow courage. I decided to use my most effective weapon, my trusty, incredibly well rehearsed belch. It was loud, deep, and utterly repulsive, I might add. My stomach, however, decided to join the fray. The herring I'd smelled moments earlier had somehow decided to make a return appearance, only this time with the added aroma of whatever last week's dinner had been. Let's just say it involved a questionable sausage and some rather wilted cabbage. My belch resonated through the forest, a monstrous sound that I'm fairly sure shook the very foundations of the earth. I added a theatrical groan, a dramatic cough, and then, for good measure, a low, guttural growl of my own. It was, shall we say, an impressive performance. The wolves, clearly disturbed by this unexpected auditory assault, paused their feast to assess this new threat. I, emboldened by the fact that they had stopped eating the herring, that repulsive fish, continued my performance, enhancing it with a series of convincing grunts, guttural growls, and an impressive display of exaggerated teeth gnashing. I used my satchel to bulk myself up and gave my most intimidating expression, my mouth twisted into a grimace that could curdle milk. Then I pulled out my most secret weapon, my uncanny ability to imitate a large and angry badger. I'd perfected this skill during a particularly unfortunate encounter with a group of drunken monks. They'd fled in terror and given me back a very expensive flask of wine I'd accidentally dropped earlier. It's something that had proven rather useful in the past. I let out a series of snorts and growls, mimicking the sounds of a badger so convincingly that even I was impressed by my own talent. I added a few strategically placed scrapes and scratches on the ground and added my guttural cries to complete the image. I hunched over, making myself appear larger, and let out a series of growls, snapping my teeth in a convincing imitation. The wolves, clearly frightened by the sudden appearance of what they perceived to be a colossal, snarling badger, promptly turned tail and fled into the night, their howls echoing through the trees. I let out a shaky breath, my legs feeling like jelly, and collapsed onto the forest floor, my laughter a mixture of relief and sheer disbelief. I'd survived. I'd survived a pack of wolves, with a herring, a belch, and an incredibly convincing badger impersonation. 7 shillings seemed less pathetic now, almost like a medal of honor, or at least a slightly less rancid substitute for a celebratory dinner. The night remained cold. The forest was still fraught with the unseen and the unknown, but for now I had managed to stave off the wolves. And the memory of that near-death experience, well, It was an experience I certainly wouldn't mind exaggerating around a fireplace and a nice mug of something stronger than water on my next break. The gate creaked open, revealing a courtyard dominated by a gloomy manor house that looked like it had seen better centuries, preferably ones without rampant outbreaks of dysentery. A surly looking servant, his face etched with the weariness of a man who dealt with far too many messengers bearing far too many pointless messages, eyed me with suspicion. 7 shillings. 7 shillings for weeks of hardship, of dodging bandits and plagues, of battling my own rather dubious stomach contents. And for what? This ignominious entrance into the hallowed halls of Lord Harrington's displeasure. I presented my carefully preserved, slightly mud-splattered, and undeniably damp scroll. The servant snatched it with the grace of a badger, snatching a particularly juicy earthworm, and disappeared inside the manor, leaving me shivering in the pre-dawn chill. My stomach growled in protest. Another unsatisfying lunch, but at least I had not shared my last herring with a wolf. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the creaking of the old manor and the increasingly insistent growls emanating from my own stomach. Finally, the servant reappeared, his expression a masterpiece of disdain. He tossed the scroll back at me, the parchment landing with a soft thud against my chest. Lord Harrington, the servant declared with the dramatic flourish of someone delivering a death sentence, refuses to accept your communication. His words were, and I quote, "The handwriting is atrocious, and the news is 2 weeks stale. What use is a raven that travels at the speed of a particularly sluggish snail? 2 weeks old, 2 weeks of blistered feet, rain-soaked nights, near-death encounters with a pack of wolves, only temporarily deterred by my uncanny badger impression and a particularly offensive belch, all for nothing." The irony wasn't lost on me. I could have sent a carrier pigeon with that message and probably saved myself the trouble, time, and the unfortunate incident with the sausage. Or better yet, a text message. I'd recently heard tell of some newfangled contraptions in the southern lands that allow for the instant communication between individuals. I still considered the possibilities of that device completely absurd. The injustice of it all gnawed at me. 2 weeks. The message detailing the urgent need for more cheese. Apparently, the cheese factory bandits had finally managed to resolve their bread ration dispute and were now demanding more cheese, had been deemed irrelevant, outdated, useless, like me. My 7 shillings, already meager compensation for weeks of toil, felt like an insult now, a slap in the face from fate itself. It was enough to buy a single, possibly diseased rat. A fitting reward for my efforts, I thought. A feast fit for a king of rats. The notion only amplified my sense of disillusionment. I sank onto a nearby stone bench, the cold seeping into my bones, mirroring the chill that had settled deep in my heart. The futility of it all was almost comical. I, Thomas, the humble messenger, had traversed treacherous landscapes, faced down ravenous wolves, and endured the indignities of a perpetually rumbling stomach, all to be met with a curt dismissal. A nobleman, sitting comfortably in his warm manor, had deemed my efforts insignificant. The audacity of it. My mind wandered to the contrast, the agonizingly slow journey, the physical exertion, the constant threat of death by a multitude of methods. Then there were modern communication methods. I'd heard whispers of devices capable of instant communication. A simple text message, a quick email, even a carrier pigeon would have been faster. The absurdity of it all struck me again, a wave of dark humor washing over my despair. It was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. My job, once merely tedious, had now become a comedy of errors, a grand, tragic farce played out on the stage of the medieval world. The audience, of course, consisted of the indifferent elements and the very few people along the route who were somewhat polite enough to offer me a swig of watered down wine. I imagined myself explaining my situation to someone in one of these modern lands. The image of their reactions, pity, amusement, disbelief, was almost enough to make me forget the gnawing emptiness in my stomach and the growing frostbite in my toes. Oh, you journeyed for weeks only to be rejected? Well, that certainly does beat the inconvenience of a dropped call, they'd probably say. A crow landed on the bench beside me, its obsidian eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. It cocked its head, as if judging my pathetic state. I couldn't help but feel a kinship with the bird, both of us messengers, both delivering messages likely to be ignored or dismissed. At least the crow didn't have to deal with the stomach issues. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a weak, hesitant light over the desolate courtyard. I stood up, my legs aching, my spirit even more so. 7 shillings, 2 weeks, a rejected message, the ingredients of a medieval messenger's perfect recipe for misery. But amidst the bleakness, a spark of resilience flickered. I might have been rejected, but I wasn't defeated. Not yet. There were more messages to deliver, more journeys to undertake, more wolves, hopefully, to outsmart. My next destination awaited, a destination I certainly hoped would provide better rewards than the pitiful sum of 7 shillings, and perhaps, just perhaps, some decent food that didn't make my stomach reject even the most hardy of medieval messengers. Even a rat would have been preferable to the taste of that old sausage. I needed to find a better patron, a better job, or better still, a better way to survive the medieval world, at least until they came up with that modern communication device. The very thought sent a new type of energy flowing through me. It was a long shot, but at least it was something to look forward to. Chapter 2. The Baron's Blunder. The sting of Lord Harrington's rejection was still fresh when a new opportunity, or rather a new indignity, presented itself. A portly man, whose breath smelled suspiciously of ale and desperation, approached me in the town square. He introduced himself as Baron Fitzwilliam, a title that seemed far too grand for a man whose doublet was patched in more places than it wasn't. He possessed a nervous energy that vibrated off him like a poorly tuned lute. "You," he declared, pointing a sausage-like finger at me. "You are the messenger, yes? The one who can, well, deliver things?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying a lack of confidence that was in stark contrast to his flamboyant title. I nodded cautiously, my skepticism a heavy weight in my gut, heavier even than my usual midday hunger. 7 shillings had been a paltry sum, but it had at least been guaranteed. This encounter had the distinct scent of unpaid labor and dubious promises. Baron Fitzwilliam produced a package. "A most urgent commission," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with a frantic energy. It wasn't just a package, it was a monstrosity, a crate so large and unwieldy that it dwarfed me. It was bound with thick ropes, haphazardly tied and secured with a variety of odd implements that looked as though they'd been scavenged from a blacksmith's scrap heap. The whole contraption looked perilously close to collapsing under its own weight. What? What is in it? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper against the wind that threatened to whisk away my remaining optimism. That, my good man, the Baron whispered conspiratorially, leaning in so close that I could smell the ale even more strongly, is a matter of utmost secrecy. Let's just say it's a gift for my very particular aunt, a gift of great delicacy. He winked, the gesture adding nothing to the mystery, but managing to increase the overall aura of suspicion surrounding the situation. Delicacy? My mind conjured images ranging from a particularly fragile pie, which would most certainly be in pieces after the journey, to a collection of exotic and rare birds, which, let's face it, would probably be dead. I imagined the possibilities of this delicacy with increasing dread. The package, whatever its contents, was going to require an expedition far beyond the usual messenger route. It was about the size of a small pony. The Baron proceeded to detail the delivery instructions. It involved navigating a treacherous mountain pass known for its unpredictable weather, bandits, and a particularly territorial species of oversized weasel with an unhealthy fondness for shiny objects. The weasels, not the bandits. He spoke rapidly, his words a jumbled mess of directions that contradicted each other. Turn left at the Whispering Pines, he instructed, then right at the Crooked Oak, unless it's raining, in which case, go straight towards the abandoned Troll's Cave, but only if the moon is waxing. Oh, and watch out for the badger, unless it's Tuesday. Then just run. My head spun. This wasn't a commission. It was a riddle wrapped in an enigma, disguised as a logistical nightmare. I tried to clarify a few points, but the Baron, already halfway down the street and apparently consumed with sudden matters related to poultry, just waved a dismissive hand and continued his frantic amble. The journey was, as anticipated, a spectacular disaster. The crate, surprisingly, did not fall apart, a testament more to luck than the Baron's haphazard packing skills. However, the weather did its best to imitate the Baron's instructions. Rain, sun, and snow all appeared within the space of an hour, while the bandits and the giant, shiny object-obsessed weasels were more than capable of causing substantial delays. The mountain pass lived up to its reputation. The terrain was treacherous, a confusing mess of jagged rocks, sudden drop-offs, and patches of ice that resembled frozen puddles of doom. I slipped, I slid, I cursed, and I contemplated throwing the colossal crate over a cliff a few times. The oversized weasels, bless their fluffy, shiny, object-obsessed hearts, proved remarkably persistent. They seemed to believe the crate itself contained a treasure trove of stolen spoons. The Troll's Cave, thankfully, remained vacant, presumably due to the ongoing housing shortage in the troll community. The Whispering Pines, however, whispered nothing but ominous sounds of the wind. I was entirely unsure if the Crooked Oak even existed, but by that point, I had resigned myself to the chaotic whims of this absurd adventure. My only consolation was that I managed to dodge any encounters with badgers, regardless of the day of the week. Perhaps my belching had inadvertently intimidated them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of battling the elements and various creatures of dubious temperament, I arrived at the Baron's aunt's residence. It was a modest cottage, a rather stark contrast to the chaotic energy of its owner's castle. It lacked the imposing grandeur of Lord Harrington's manor. Instead, it possessed a certain homely charm, a sense of quiet tranquility. The aunt, a surprisingly cheerful old woman with a twinkle in her eye, accepted the crate with a smile. She didn't ask questions about its contents, about the journey, or about the Baron's baffling instructions. She just thanked me with a warm smile and a surprisingly generous sum of money, enough to buy a month's supply of decent food, which is far more than any messenger could realistically hope for. Returning to the Baron's castle several weeks later, I found the estate in disarray. It looked like a scene from a particularly messy play, with half-eaten food lying scattered on the floor, furniture turned on its side, and livestock wandering aimlessly about. As I neared the outer wall, a small, emaciated pig ran past me, looking like it desperately needed therapy. That was just the introduction to the chaos within the Baron's abode. This time, I was greeted not by a flustered baron, but by a small band of angry villagers, each clutching a bill for unpaid services. Apparently, the baron's gift was not a gift at all. It contained a large batch of rotten turnips he had tried to pass off as exotic vegetables. The villagers were not amused. The baron, I learned, was now busy attempting to escape in his underwear, using a rather badly assembled raft down the nearby river. His particular breed of incompetence was certainly noteworthy, almost legendary in its awfulness. My own journey had its moments of absurdity, but at least my incompetence was only self-inflicted. The Baron's actions, on the other hand, had caused an international incident amongst the surrounding villages. His incompetence, in contrast to mine, was truly a force of nature. I found a certain dark humor in the situation. It was almost a relief to have my own failures pale in comparison to the Baron's spectacular implosion. I departed from his property, the villagers' rage a low hum behind me, the image of the fleeing Baron in his underwear, a mental bookmark for a tale I'd happily share with other messengers around the region. I collected my well-deserved payment from the relieved aunt and promptly left, making sure to leave a note behind explaining the Baron's actions to prevent similar incidents in the future. As I walked away, I couldn't help but mutter, 7 shillings? Please. I deserved more, much more, for witnessing the greatest spectacle of medieval incompetence. The wind seemed to whistle in agreement, and maybe, just maybe, it whispered a few words about the newfangled texting device that was making its way to the region. Perhaps this was the time I finally take a leap of faith. The Baron's aunt's cottage, a beacon of unexpected calm after the maelstrom of the mountain pass, was barely a respite. My next commission, a missive supposedly containing vital information regarding the price of turnips, a subject apparently of great importance in the region, required a journey through the infamous Swamp of Sorrows. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, a place where even the most seasoned travelers feared to tread, a mire of murky water, treacherous bogs, and creatures of nightmare. To me it sounded like Tuesday afternoon. The swamp was everything they said it was, and more. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay and damp earth, a symphony of unpleasant odors punctuated by the croaking of unseen amphibians. The ground beneath my feet was a treacherous cocktail of mud, reeds, and hidden pockets of quicksand, which seemed intent on swallowing me whole, one soggy footstep at a time. The crate, still miraculously intact, became my most reliable companion, acting as a sort of makeshift raft, though it proved more of a hindrance than a help, as its sheer size made navigating the narrow passages and submerged tree trunks a challenge of Olympic proportions. My first encounter was with a bullfrog of gargantuan proportions. This wasn't your average garden variety amphibian. This was a creature that could comfortably double as a small pony. It sat, throne like, upon a particularly large lily pad, its bulging eyes regarding me with an unsettling intelligence. Its croak echoed through the swamp like a mournful foghorn. Instead of the charming ribbit of its smaller cousins, this behemoth emitted a sound more akin to a rusty gate swinging in a hurricane. I, of course, responded by accidentally stepping on a particularly slimy patch of mud, sending me into a full-blown, swamp-induced ballet of near drowning and panicked flailing. The frog, far from amused, opened its enormous maw and attempted to swallow the crate, me and all. Fortunately, the ropes proved surprisingly strong, or perhaps the frog had a slight overestimation of its own jaw strength. It gave up with a disgruntled croak and plunged back into the depths, leaving me covered in muck and somewhat traumatized, but ultimately unharmed. Progress through the swamp was a series of near misses. Giant spiders the size of dinner plates spun webs that shimmered deceptively in the murky sunlight, their strands stronger than any rope I'd ever encountered. I navigated past them by utilizing my patented messenger's shuffle, a bizarre combination of crab-like walking and a series of increasingly desperate prayers. The vegetation itself was hostile, a tangled mess of thorny vines and grasping weeds that seemed determined to ensnare me and keep me as a swamp-based decoration. My next encounter was with an ogre, or at least, that's what I assumed. He was large, green, and possessed a rather impressive collection of warts, but he wasn't the stereotypical brute I'd expected. He was sitting on a moss-covered stump, meticulously balancing his accounts on a surprisingly well-preserved slate. It turned out he was a tax collector, albeit one who lived in a swamp and wore only a loincloth that looked suspiciously like a particularly large, mud-caked leaf. He surprised me not with his size or his appearance, but with his surprisingly sophisticated knowledge of medieval economics. We spent a good hour discussing the fluctuating prices of grains and the impact of seasonal flooding on market availability. He even gave me a few tips on how to haggle more effectively, knowledge I was certain would come in handy, considering my less than stellar record with bartering. He didn't charge me for his financial advice, only requesting a small portion of the turnips for his stew. They were unfortunately quite rotten by that point, but he seemed unperturbed. He was, after all, an ogre, used to a certain level of culinary disappointment. Navigation in the swamp of sorrows proved to be an exercise in exquisite frustration. I was lost more times than I cared to count, each lost turn a seemingly endless loop of mud, reeds, and the incessant croaking of the swamp's inhabitants. One particularly egregious instance involved me stumbling upon a clearing, only to realize it was the same clearing I'd seen an hour earlier. despite having traveled what felt like a significant distance. This particular loop made me question the very nature of space, time, and sanity. I began to consider constructing a series of increasingly elaborate landmarks from mud and sticks to assist me in my navigation, but discovered my mud sculpting skills were less than impressive. The sun beat down mercilessly, only adding to my misery. The air hung heavy and still, the humid atmosphere weighing on my spirit. Each step seemed heavier, each breath shallower. Dehydration became a significant concern. My water skin, a gift from the Baron's aunt, had sprung a leak somewhere during the mountain pass ordeal. I considered drinking the swamp water, a suicidal thought, I admit, before settling on licking a particularly large, glistening leaf instead. It was not refreshing, but it was somewhat moist. The final leg of the journey was, if possible, even more harrowing. The swamp transformed into a dense, claustrophobic jungle of vegetation. Thick, choking vines obscured every direction, turning every step into an act of faith and a lot of shouting. I nearly lost the crate several times, getting it tangled in a particularly dense thicket. The only way to free it was by using a rather sharp-looking stick, which I discovered I had somehow acquired from the swamp. In hindsight, perhaps the swamp had developed a sense of humor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of struggling through the swamp, I emerged, bruised, battered, and smelling suspiciously of mud, decay, and desperation. The recipient of the turnip-related message, a rather disgruntled farmer, was less than impressed with the condition of the message. However, he paid me handsomely. The turnips apparently had a higher than expected value, a fact he had forgotten before due to my arrival. I learned an important lesson. Never underestimate the value of a timely delivery, even if said delivery involves navigating a swamp filled with giant bullfrogs, swamp ogres who surprisingly give you good financial advice, and the constant threat of being swallowed whole by the earth. I was exhausted, but alive, and surprisingly, I didn't have any encounters with badgers that day either. Perhaps the swamp was a badger-free zone, or maybe the badgers had better things to do than deal with my swamp-induced misery. Either way, I was thankful. My ordeal with the Swamp of Sorrows was but a prelude to the next leg of my journey, the treacherous crossing of the River Styx, or, as the locals more prosaically called it, the River Brine. This wasn't some gentle stream. It was a raging torrent, a churning mass of muddy water that seemed intent on devouring anything that dared to approach its banks. The bridge, naturally, had collapsed centuries ago, leaving only splintered remnants to mock the unwary traveler. My commission, a particularly urgent message for the Baron of Blackwood, detailing, I swear I'm not making this up, the precise shade of blue required for his new tapestry. Apparently, the wrong shade of blue could incite an international incident, or at least a very grumpy baron. My first attempt at crossing involved a raft constructed from driftwood and the remains of a broken cart. It was less a vessel of transport and more a floating disaster waiting to happen. Upon launching my rickety craft, the current immediately demonstrated its utter contempt for my engineering skills. The raft splintered, more like a cheap cracker than sturdy timber, and I found myself knee-deep in the freezing, muddy water, clinging to a particularly stubborn piece of driftwood, while the rest of my makeshift vessel pirouetted downstream a pathetic spectacle of human ambition versus natural indifference. Undeterred, or perhaps just too stubborn to admit defeat, I sought alternative means of crossing. My eyes fell upon a rather plump goose, calmly preening itself on the riverbank. Now, I'm not an expert in avian transportation, but I figured a goose, with its presumably superior paddling skills, could be persuaded into service. My attempts at persuasion involved a mixture of gentle coaxing, frantic waving of my arms, and increasingly desperate promises of copious amounts of barley, which I sadly did not possess. The goose, in its infinite wisdom, remained unimpressed. It regarded my efforts with the detached amusement one might reserve for a particularly inept badger attempting to fly. Finally, after a lengthy negotiation that involved several near drowning experiences and the sacrifice of half my lunch, a rather stale crust of bread, it agreed to my proposition as long as I didn't make it sing. The goose, whose name I'd christened Captain Quackers, proved to be a surprisingly capable navigator, though its approach to river crossing was considerably more chaotic than mine. Our voyage was a thrilling ride of paddling, squawking, and near capsizes. At one point, we narrowly avoided a collision with a submerged log, the impact of which would have likely resulted in a very wet messenger and an extremely indignant goose. Captain Quackers, for his part, proved remarkably resilient, but seemed highly unappreciative of my increasingly frantic attempts to steer us towards the other side. Just as I started considering the possibility of swimming the rest of the way, a terrifying proposition, a stroke of unexpected luck occurred. During one of Captain Quacker's particularly aggressive paddling maneuvers, the goose's large webbed foot dislodged a loose stone on the riverbank. The stone, much larger than it appeared, tumbled down a surprisingly steep embankment, revealing a dark, narrow opening in the cliff face. Curiosity and a desperate desire to escape the increasingly violent gyrations of Captain Quackers prompted me to investigate. The opening looked suspiciously like a tunnel, dark and ominously damp. A whiff of stale air and something faintly resembling sulfur wafted out, but at that point, I figured a trip through the underworld was a preferable alternative to another near drowning experience. Inside, the tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic. Water dripped from the ceiling, forming miniature waterfalls that resembled tiny, menacing dragons. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and something distinctly unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. I found myself crawling on my hands and knees, the muddy water seeping into my boots, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The tunnel wound through the earth for what felt like an eternity. I started to entertain the notion that I'd taken a wrong turn and was now on an express route to the center of the earth. Doubt crept in, but the alternative, continuing my perilous journey with a resentful goose, seemed far less appealing. My progress was slow, laborious, and punctuated by moments of panic whenever I stumbled or misjudged a step. My only illumination was the weak light coming from the entrance, which steadily diminished as I journeyed deeper into the earth. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged onto the other side of the river. I was muddy, bruised, slightly damp, and smelling vaguely of sulfur, but I was dry. I was across the river, and more importantly, alive. Captain Quackers, having apparently found a more suitable perch and a significantly larger supply of barley, was nowhere in sight. I supposed I should have offered him a cut of the Baron's payment, but frankly, I felt I'd earned it all. The Baron, upon receiving the message detailing the precise shade of blue, was surprisingly pleased. He apparently had been on the verge of launching a full-scale war with a neighboring baron over a similar shade dispute. My timely delivery had averted disaster and earned me a rather generous reward, which promptly went towards replacing my soggy boots, getting my clothes cleaned, and most importantly, buying a large quantity of delicious barley. Perhaps, I reflected, there's something to be said for the unconventional approach to life, even if it involves a questionable raft, an argumentative goose, and a rather unexpected trip through a subterranean passage. Next time, though, I'm investing in a better map. My escape from the River Brine, while triumphant, only served as a brief respite before the next chapter in my saga of misadventure unfolded. The path to the Baron of Blackwood's castle led directly through the Whispering Mountains, a range whose name, I soon discovered, was far more poetic than the reality. The mountains weren't merely whispering, they were shouting, groaning, and occasionally throwing rocks the size of small dogs at unsuspecting travelers. The first challenge presented itself in the form of an avalanche. Not a particularly large one, mind you, but enough to send me tumbling down a snow-covered slope, my precious message clutched tightly to my chest. The descent was less graceful than a drunken walrus attempting a ballet routine. I landed in a surprisingly soft snowdrift, more bruised than broken, but with a newfound appreciation for the insulating properties of snow. After I disentangled myself from a tangled mass of branches and a rather disgruntled snowshoe hare, I continued on my way, my previously crisp parchment now bearing a faint but distinct resemblance to a Jackson Pollock painting. My next encounter was with bandits. Unlike the previous bunch, who were more interested in napping than robbing, these highwaymen possessed a modicum of competence. Their ambush, however, was less a cunning tactical maneuver and more an exercise in clumsy theatrics. Their leader, a man with a surprisingly elaborate handlebar mustache that seemed to defy the laws of gravity, yelled threats in a voice that would have been more appropriate for a town crier advertising a particularly dull puppet show. His underlings, meanwhile, tripped over their own feet, struggled with their rusty swords, and generally looked more like a collection of bewildered toddlers than hardened criminals. The attempted robbery quickly devolved into chaos. One bandit accidentally set fire to his own beard, a truly spectacular display of self-immolation. Another became hopelessly entangled in a thicket of thorns, and the leader, still bellowing threats, tripped over his own mustache, ending up face first in the snow. Seeing my chance, I slipped past them, leaving them to sort out their self-inflicted woes. I couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for their enthusiasm, though their tactical skills left much to be desired. One could almost admire their sheer, unadulterated incompetence. Further up the mountain, I stumbled upon a scene of such bizarre religious fervor that even my jaded sensibilities were somewhat taken aback. A group of individuals, dressed in robes of questionable hygiene, were engaged in a ceremony involving a goat, a rather eccentric-looking priest with an alarmingly large hat, and what appeared to be a collection of oddly shaped stones. The goat, seemingly the central figure of the ritual, displayed an astonishing lack of piety, preferring to munch on the priest's robe rather than participate in the chanting. The priest, whose beard rivaled that of a particularly well-groomed mountain troll, seemed strangely unbothered by the goat's blatant disregard for religious protocol. He continued his incantations, his voice echoing through the mountains, punctuated by the goat's contented chewing and the occasional bleat of protest from the other participants, who seemed equally unimpressed by the proceedings. I decided discretion was the better part of valor and discreetly slipped away, muttering a quick prayer to any deity who might be listening, hoping for a speedy deliverance from this religious spectacle. I wasn't entirely sure what god they were worshipping, but I suspected they would be disappointed if they learned of my silent departure. As if to test my resilience further, the mountain path then took a sharp, unexpected turn downwards, revealing a seemingly bottomless chasm. My carefully plotted route, gleaned from a map that had clearly been drawn by someone with a severe case of geographic amnesia, had failed me once more. I was faced with a choice: a terrifying drop into the abyss, or an equally terrifying climb back up the treacherous cliff face. My choice was clear, even though my knees weren't entirely convinced. The ensuing ascent was a display of agility I didn't know I possessed, involving precarious footholds, agonizing scrapes, and several close calls that had me swearing my way towards the summit. Upon reaching what I hoped was safer ground, I discovered a narrow, winding path that hugged the cliffside, offering breathtaking views, if one could ignore the very real possibility of plummeting to one's doom. The path was treacherous, a narrow ledge carved into the rock face, with sheer drops on either side. My progress was slow, deliberate, and punctuated by moments of abject terror whenever a loose stone threatened to send me tumbling into the valley below. My arms ached, my legs trembled, and my resolve started to fray. Along the way, I encountered several more peculiar characters: a hermit living in a cave, carved into the mountainside, who offered me questionable advice and even more questionable herbal tea; a group of traveling musicians playing jaunty tunes on instruments made from animal bones and repurposed cooking pots, whose music was both alarming and strangely catchy; and most memorably, a woman who claimed to be able to communicate with mountain spirits, an assertion she supported with an array of rather dubious pronouncements and an even more dubious collection of oddly colored crystals. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of scaling cliffs, navigating precarious ledges, and dodging eccentric hermits, I reached the other side of the Whispering Mountains. I was exhausted, bruised, covered in dirt, and smelling faintly of goat and questionable herbal tea, but I had made it. The Baron's castle loomed in the distance, a beacon of civilization, a symbol of relief, a sign that the ordeal of the mountain pass was finally behind me. Or so I thought. Little did I know that the Baron himself presented a unique and entirely unexpected challenge, one that dwarfed the combined terrors of avalanches, inept bandits, and strangely religious goat-worshipping ceremonies. My journey, it seemed, was far from over. The Baron of Blackwood's castle, I discovered upon closer inspection, was less a majestic fortress and more the rather dilapidated structure that appeared to be perpetually on the verge of collapse. It leaned precariously to one side, as if contemplating a dramatic exit from the landscape. The drawbridge, or what remained of it, hung limply, resembling a deflated sausage more than a defensive mechanism. The surrounding moat, once presumably fearsome, was now a stagnant puddle, teeming with something that vaguely resembled oversized tadpoles, but which I strongly suspected were actually miniature aquatic monsters. I approached the castle gates with a mixture of trepidation and weariness, my once crisp message now a crumpled, mud caked mess. A surly looking guard, whose armor seemed to be constructed from repurposed cooking pots, eyed me with suspicion. He hadn't shaved in what appeared to be several weeks, and his breath could curdle milk at 50 paces. After what felt like an eternity of intense scrutiny, during which I was almost convinced he was attempting to assess my suitability as a replacement for one of the moat monsters, he finally grumbled a greeting and gestured me towards the main hall. The Baron himself, when I finally encountered him, turned out to be a rather portly gentleman with a penchant for brightly colored silks and a surprisingly high-pitched giggle. He looked less like a fearsome lord of the manor and more like a particularly flamboyant rooster. He received my message, or rather what remained of it, with an air of bored indifference, barely glancing at the smudged, mud-stained parchment before tossing it aside with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Ah, the goods," he chirped, his giggle echoing through the hall. "Excellent, excellent. I trust they arrived in pristine condition?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he continued before I could utter a single word. "Unfortunately," he declared, his voice suddenly taking on a dramatic, conspiratorial tone, "I must confess to a slight misunderstanding. I seem to have misplaced the list of contents. However, I'm sure whatever is inside is precisely what I ordered. Absolutely exquisite. Quite the investment, you understand." He winked, revealing a disconcerting gap in his upper teeth. I was, needless to say, more than a little perplexed. Hesitantly, I produced the package. It was, to put it mildly, unremarkable. A rather flimsy, roughly woven sack, tied with a piece of twine that looked as though it had seen better days. It bulged slightly, but didn't feel particularly heavy. My curiosity and a growing sense of dread prompted me to cautiously untie the twine. The contents were far from exquisite. In fact, they were offensively pungent. A wave of nauseating aroma hit me, a foul concoction of decaying vegetation and something that strongly resembled aged cheese. The sack contained not the precious silks and spices the Baron had so eagerly anticipated, but a bewildering assortment of rotten vegetables and several moldy cheeses, each of dubious origin and even more dubious odor. My stomach lurched. The Baron's high-pitched giggles ceased abruptly. His face, once flushed with a rosy, expectant hue, now resembled a deflated plum. He peered into the sack, his eyes widening in disbelief, then slowly narrowing in what could only be described as a mixture of horror and confusion. The air hung thick with the smell of decay, punctuated by the Baron's increasingly audible sputtering. "These," he finally managed to croak, his voice strained. "These are not the silks, the spices, the things I ordered." I mumbled an apology, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, burgeoning sense of amusement. The entire journey, the perilous mountain pass, the near-death experiences, all for this? A delivery of rotten vegetables and moldy cheese. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on me. The Baron, after a moment of stunned silence, burst into a fit of surprisingly loud, unrestrained laughter. He wiped away a tear that had escaped his eye and then proceeded to explain that the entire order had been a jest, a test of my dedication, he called it, a joke played on the messenger service, a way to see how far one would go for a job that was, let's be honest, utterly pointless. It turns out that the valuable goods were never actually intended for him. The entire affair, the supposed urgent delivery, the insistence on secrecy, all of it a meticulously crafted ruse. The Baron, in fact, was not the intended recipient. He'd simply overheard my instructions, found the whole thing amusing, and decided to see how the situation would play out. The real recipient, he revealed with a hearty chuckle, was Old Man Fitzwilliam, a local farmer known for his notoriously stubborn disposition and equally notorious fondness for unusually pungent fertilizers. The Baron had concocted this entire elaborate charade as a prank to supply Fitzwilliam with the finest fertilizer in the land. We were joined by Old Man Fitzwilliam, who found the humor in the situation in his own way. After being informed of the Baron's joke, he clapped the Baron heartily on the back. Taking the sack of produce, he thanked me for the timely delivery. He even slipped me a small coin and a surprisingly sincere compliment on my perseverance and commitment to my task. I watched, dumbfounded, as he happily added the contents of the sack to his compost heap, the aroma blending seamlessly with the other delightful odors of the farmyard. The experience, while undoubtedly bizarre, left me with a profound sense of anticlimactic satisfaction. The journey had been arduous, dangerous, and utterly ridiculous, culminating in the delivery of a package containing the world's most pungent fertilizer. Yet, in the midst of the absurdity, I found a strange sort of dark humor. It was a grim reminder of the meaningless nature of the tasks I so diligently undertook, and a testament to the absurd nature of life in the medieval era. It was, in short, a perfect encapsulation of my career as a medieval messenger, and somehow that made it all worthwhile. The Baron's blunder was, in its own peculiar way, a masterpiece of medieval mayhem, and I, its unwitting participant, was left with nothing but a smelly sack, a bruised ego, and a rather amused sense of resignation. My next assignment, I knew, could only be better, or perhaps even more absurdly worse. The possibilities, as always, were endless. The adventure, I suspected, was far from over. Chapter 3. A Royal Mess. The mud still clung stubbornly to my boots, a testament to my recent, less than glamorous encounter with the Baron of Blackwood and his unique brand of humor. I'd barely had time to wash the stench of rotten vegetables from my clothes when a royal summons arrived, delivered by a flustered, sweating courier whose uniform was far more pristine than my own. Apparently, my services were required at court, and required immediately. The official-looking seal impressed onto the wax was almost comical, considering the message it bore, an accusation of treason. Treason? Me? I, a humble messenger, whose most daring exploits involved dodging rogue chickens and navigating particularly treacherous bogs. The journey to the royal court was a stark contrast to my previous adventures. Instead of rutted tracks and treacherous mountain passes, I traversed smooth, well-maintained roads lined with perfectly manicured hedges. The air, instead of the pungent aroma of decaying flora and livestock, was perfumed with the sweet scent of roses and something faintly citrusy, perhaps a particularly expensive brand of air freshener for royalty. My arrival at the palace was met with a level of formality that bordered on the absurd. Guards in gleaming armor, their faces impassive, scrutinized me with an intensity that suggested I was carrying a plague ridden unicorn rather than a simple message pouch. The palace itself was a monument to excess. Imposing towers pierced the sky, each adorned with ornate carvings and shimmering spires. The sheer scale of the building was overwhelming. Massive, intricately designed gates guarded the entrance, a stark contrast to the baron's dilapidated drawbridge. Everywhere I looked, gold glittered, in the elaborate detailing of the windows, in the intricate patterns woven into the tapestries hanging from the walls, even in the seemingly endless supply of golden goblets that adorned every available surface. My own appearance, in comparison, felt profoundly inadequate. My once crisp tunic was now a patchwork of mud stains, rips, and what I suspected were ancient fruit splatters. My boots, still clinging to the remnants of Blackwood swamp, were definitely not fit for a royal audience. I felt like a particularly grubby badger attempting to infiltrate a swan's elegant gathering. The royal chamber itself was a breathtaking spectacle of opulence. The walls were hung with massive tapestries depicting scenes of legendary battles and heroic feats, though many seemed a tad too enthusiastically rendered in their depictions of heroic bloodshed. The floor was polished to a gleaming mirror finish, reflecting the chandeliers that hung from the high, vaulted ceiling like dazzling constellations of crystal. It was an overwhelming display of wealth and power, a stark contrast to the simplicity, or rather, the abject dilapidation of the baron's residence. I was led before the king himself, a man of imposing stature and a somewhat severe expression, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of amusement I could not quite decipher. He was seated upon a throne that could probably accommodate a small family, adorned with jewels that could probably fund a small kingdom, and draped in fabrics that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The king's attire was more splendid than anything I had ever witnessed, or even imagined. The contrast between his regal splendor and my own travel-worn appearance was, I suspected, unintentional comedy at its finest. The accusation, when it came, was as ridiculous as it was serious. Apparently, I was implicated in a scandalous incident during a recent royal hunting expedition. A very bizarre hunting expedition, it seems, involving a rogue boar, a misplaced hunting horn, a flock of startled geese, and a surprisingly large amount of mead, culminating in a near disaster that nearly led to the king's demise. My role, according to the official account, involved supplying the boar with the mead through an elaborate network of underground tunnels I had supposedly constructed as part of a grand plot to dethrone the king. I attempted to explain that I was merely a messenger, that my only involvement in the royal hunt had been inadvertently delaying it by a few hours due to a particularly stubborn ox blocking a small rural bridge. But my protests were met with a mixture of polite indifference and barely concealed skepticism. The king, I noticed, was not averse to suppressing a chuckle. His counselors, however, were much less tolerant of my explanation. The evidence against me, as flimsy as it was, comprised of one rather mud-caked envelope, which I had indeed been carrying, though I'd already delivered its contents to Old Man Fitzwilliam, and a rather imaginative interpretation of my muddy footsteps near the scene of the crime. Apparently, my boots were deemed to be of sufficient uniqueness to have left an undeniable impression, or rather multiple impressions, at the scene. The proceedings dragged on for what felt like an eternity. I was subjected to a series of increasingly absurd interrogations, involving questions about my alleged proficiency in boar whisperer techniques, the exact ingredients of my supposed sedative mead, and the structural integrity of my purported underground tunnel system. My attempts at logical explanations were consistently met with raised eyebrows, knowing glances between the king's advisers, and a growing suspicion that the whole affair was a meticulously crafted joke. A very high stakes, potentially life threatening joke, but a joke nevertheless. The final verdict, when it came, was as unexpected as it was somewhat anticlimactic. The king, after a prolonged period of thoughtful silence, during which he seemingly contemplated the finer points of my mud-caked boot prints, declared me innocent. Not, however, due to lack of evidence or a sound defense, but rather a recognition of a shared sense of dark, absurd humor. It seemed the king had a penchant for the ridiculous, a taste for the unexpected, perhaps even a deep understanding of how utterly pointless and frequently chaotic the events of everyday life can be. He chuckled, a deep, booming sound that echoed through the grand hall, startling several of his more serious advisers. He declared the whole hunt incident a delightfully farcical mishap, and that he had himself enjoyed a good hearty laugh over the detailed accounts of my treasonous activities. The matter was closed, seemingly with no further punishment, though I did sense a gleam of mischief in his eyes as he mentioned my remarkable resilience and my impressive ability to traverse treacherous terrain. This could have easily been an oblique reference to a future assignment, one possibly even more treacherous than the Baron of Blackwood's rotten vegetables. The possibility was both exhilarating and deeply terrifying. The adventure, as ever, seemed far from over. My acquittal, it turned out, was merely the prelude to a farcical performance worthy of the most inept traveling players. The king's amusement, I soon discovered, was not the end of my royal entanglement, but rather the opening act of a truly bizarre play, with myself unwittingly cast as the bumbling protagonist. My supposed innocence was swiftly forgotten as I was thrust into the heart of a conspiracy so convoluted, so utterly ridiculous, that even I, a seasoned veteran of bog dodging and chicken chasing, found myself utterly bewildered. It began, as most farcical plots do, with a missing object of immense if somewhat questionable value, a jeweled spoon. Not just any spoon, mind you, but a spoon that had apparently belonged to a long-dead queen, possessing, according to court legend, the power to grant eternal youth. The legend, I suspected, was less about eternal youth and more about the sheer opulence of the jeweled handle and the exorbitant price the royal goldsmith must have charged for it. Regardless of its magical properties, or lack thereof, the spoon's disappearance had ignited a firestorm of suspicion and whispered accusations throughout the palace. The prime suspect, naturally, was Lord Harrington, a man whose arrogance was only surpassed by his absurdly flamboyant attire. His clothes alone could have funded a small war, and his powdered wig seemed to contain enough flour to feed a family for a week. His reputation preceded him. A master of intrigue, rumor had it, a virtuoso of veiled threats and backstabbing smiles. The man was the very embodiment of courtly duplicity. He, of course, vehemently denied any involvement, his voice dripping with offended indignation, a performance almost as convincing as the spoon's supposed magical properties. Then there was Lady Beatrice, a woman whose beauty was only matched by her cunning. She possessed the sharp wit of a viper and the manipulative charm of a siren, a deadly combination that rendered her both captivating and utterly terrifying. Her supposed alibi, a rather implausible tale involving a sudden urge to embroider tapestries under the moonlight, was met with skeptical silence by the king's advisers. Her involvement, if any, was as shrouded in mystery as the whereabouts of the spoon itself. My own involvement, however, was far more accidental. It seems that, in my hasty escape from the previous accusation, I had inadvertently stumbled upon a secret passage, a hidden corridor concealed behind a rather unremarkable tapestry depicting a particularly gruesome battle scene. The artist, I suspected, had a real talent for depicting bloodshed. This passage, as I later learned, led to a network of tunnels beneath the palace, a veritable rabbit warren of corridors and hidden chambers, perfect for clandestine meetings, secret rendezvous, and the concealment of precious, possibly magical silverware. The absurdity of it all was almost unbearable. I found myself shuttling between interrogations by Lord Harrington's intensely suspicious guards, who seemed convinced I was a part of a vast, spoon-centric conspiracy, clandestine meetings with Lady Beatrice, who appeared to know more than she let on, and whose whispered hints only added to the overall chaos, and frantic attempts to explain my utter lack of involvement to the increasingly exasperated king. The palace, usually a monument to stately order, was now a whirlwind of frenzied activity. Guards darted through corridors, their footsteps echoing through the vast halls. Whispers followed me like shadows, each a new and more outlandish accusation. I found myself navigating a labyrinthine plot, dodging suspicious courtiers, interpreting cryptic messages, mostly scribbled on napkins, and inadvertently causing further chaos with my clumsiness. I tripped over a royal lapdog, causing a minor stampede among the assembled courtiers. I knocked over a priceless vase during a particularly tense exchange with Lord Harrington, and I accidentally set off a series of alarms while attempting to locate a rather important-looking key. My encounters with the various characters were a masterclass in comical misunderstandings. Lord Harrington accused me of stealing the spoon, using a rather shaky interpretation of my muddy footprints as evidence. Lady Beatrice flirted with me while subtly interrogating me about my knowledge of the palace's secret passages, and the king's head chef, a surprisingly insightful man with a deep-seated hatred for Lord Harrington, offered me questionable advice, alongside an unusually large helping of roasted pheasant. The climax of the affair, as one might expect, was as chaotic and unpredictable as the events leading up to it. A grand confrontation in the royal library, a desperate chase through the palace's underground tunnels, a series of mistaken identities. I was momentarily mistaken for Lord Harrington's long-lost twin brother, a remarkably improbable event, considering I had never even met the man, and a rather dramatic reveal involving a disgruntled royal butler, a hidden compartment, and the actual location of the jeweled spoon. It was, rather anticlimactically, hidden inside a hollowed out copy of a very dull treatise on medieval poultry farming. The resolution, predictably, was absurd. The real thief, it turned out, was a surprisingly nimble parrot belonging to the king's favorite jester, who had a penchant for shiny objects and a surprisingly skillful ability to open locked chests. The bird, seemingly unrepentant, was seen later preening itself with the recovered spoon, completely oblivious to the chaos it had caused. The entire episode seemed to solidify the king's appreciation for the absurd. Instead of punishment, there were rewards. The king, having a hearty laugh over the entire incident, rewarded me handsomely for my unwitting role in the retrieval of the spoon, my compensation generously exceeding my usual messenger's fee. Lady Beatrice, it turned out, was amused by my accidental heroics, while Lord Harrington, humbled but still impeccably dressed, was surprisingly gracious in defeat, perhaps recognizing the absurdity of the whole situation. The court for once seemed united in a shared appreciation for the chaotic and entirely unexpected. The chaos, however, was far from over. As the king's laughter faded, a new message arrived, sealed with a royal seal, its wax still warm. My next assignment, it seemed, involved a rogue unicorn and a shipment of highly flammable spices to the Sultan of the Far East. The adventure, it seemed, was far from over. The world, as ever, continued its merry dance of chaos, and I, its perpetually bewildered messenger, was caught up in its glorious, ridiculous swirl. The courtroom was a stifling affair, thick with the scent of beeswax and the nervous sweat of onlookers. My accusers, a motley crew of disgruntled villagers and overzealous guards, were arrayed before the judge, a portly man whose wig seemed perpetually threatened by gravity. The air crackled with anticipation, or perhaps it was just the ominous creaking of the ancient wooden beams overhead. My crimes, as detailed by the prosecution, were a masterpiece of farcical exaggeration. First came Agnes Periwinkle, a woman whose perpetually sour expression suggested a lifetime of unfortunate encounters with rogue poultry. She claimed I'd stolen her prize goose, a magnificent bird she called Bartholomew, alleging I'd disguised him in a traveling cloak and spirited him away on my mule. Her testimony was punctuated by theatrical sobs and dramatic gestures, further fueled by the fact that Bartholomew, unbeknownst to her, had found himself quite happily ensconced in the judge's kitchen, happily gobbling down scraps of pastry. Next came a breathless stable boy, who swore under oath that he'd seen me, in the dead of night, wrestling with a rather large and hairy wig. This wig, it transpired, belonged to the town's mayor, a notoriously vain man who valued his elaborate headpiece above all earthly possessions. The boy's description of the struggle, complete with exaggerated grunts and thrashing limbs, was highly entertaining, though completely irrelevant to any actual crime. It turned out the mayor had simply mislaid his wig after a particularly boisterous night at the tavern. He'd, in fact, been found fast asleep amidst a pile of hay bales, his wig snugly tucked beneath his snoring form. The most compelling, or perhaps the most ludicrous evidence, was provided by old Silas, a toothless hermit who resided in a swamp on the outskirts of town. Silas, a man whose vocabulary consisted mainly of grunts and guttural pronouncements, claimed to have witnessed a clandestine meeting between myself and the legendary swamp-dwelling ogre, Grungle. Silas's testimony, delivered in a series of rambling pronouncements and illustrated by crude drawings on the back of a tavern bill, painted a vivid picture of a conspiracy involving stolen jewels, enchanted sausages, and a plot to overthrow the local council. It was so fantastical, so completely outlandish, that even the most skeptical members of the court found themselves struggling to suppress a smile. The reality was far less dramatic. My meeting with Grungle involved accidentally stumbling into his bog and subsequently spending an hour untangling myself from his rather impressive collection of reeds and mud. The defense, led by a wizened lawyer named Bartholomew, no relation to Agnes Periwinkle's goose, I assure you, was a masterpiece of understated sarcasm. He subtly questioned the reliability of Agnes's memory. After all, she'd also accused the local baker of stealing her knitting needles, pointed out the highly improbable nature of the wig incident, and suggested that Silas's encounter with the ogre had been significantly embellished by copious amounts of fermented swamp water. He then proceeded to present an airtight alibi, demonstrating, through a series of meticulously documented receipts, that I'd been attending a rather dull regional pigeon racing competition at the precise moment the alleged crimes had taken place. The judge, clearly struggling to maintain an air of judicial gravitas amid the escalating absurdity, banged his gavel with increasing desperation. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of conflicting opinions, with several spectators breaking into impromptu debates on the finer points of goose identification and the ethical implications of wig snatching. Amidst the chaos, I found myself surprisingly calm, almost amused by the entire proceeding. It was, after all, merely another day in the life of a medieval messenger. After what felt like an eternity, the verdict was announced. Not guilty. The judge, his face a mixture of relief and utter bewilderment, declared that the evidence against me was, to put it mildly, unconvincing. The crowd erupted in a wave of delighted chatter, punctuated by the occasional triumphant squawk from Bartholomew the goose, who apparently had escaped from the judge's kitchen and found his way back to Agnes Periwinkle, much to her astonishment. My acquittal, however, was not the end of the matter. The incident had attracted the attention of the king's own spies, who, fascinated by the sheer absurdity of my trial, decided to investigate further. They discovered a far more sinister plot, a conspiracy far more elaborate and considerably less amusing than a simple case of goose napping. It involved, as I would soon discover, a misplaced royal decree, a shipment of questionable sausages, and a group of disgruntled butchers who'd planned to replace the king's favorite sausages with ones made from rather unusual ingredients. The investigation led me on a merry chase through shadowy alleys, cobblestone streets, and secret taverns, the air thick with whispers and veiled threats. I found myself interviewing disgruntled chefs, interrogating nervous butchers, and deciphering cryptic messages left on stale bread crusts. Each clue led to another, unraveling a tangled web of deception and intrigue that was both frightening and hilariously convoluted. The investigation's climax took place within the king's own kitchens. I, armed with a rather blunt carving knife and a surprisingly accurate knowledge of sausage-making techniques, faced off against the ringleaders of the conspiracy, a portly butcher with a penchant for over-seasoning and a disgruntled royal chef who'd been demoted for his habit of adding questionable ingredients to the king's soup. The ensuing confrontation involved a dramatic chase across the kitchen, flying spices, sizzling sausages, and a near miss with a boiling cauldron of stew. In the end, it was a rather anticlimactic resolution. The king, it turned out, had already suspected foul play, having noticed a peculiar change in the taste of his sausages. The conspirators, cornered and outmatched, confessed their crimes, admitting to a plan that involved replacing the royal sausages with suspiciously similar looking ones made from a variety of less than desirable meats. The king, ever amused by the absurdity of it all, sentenced the conspirators to a life of peeling potatoes, a punishment considered far worse than imprisonment by most royal chefs. As for me, I was again rewarded for my inadvertent contribution to justice, this time with a lifetime supply of the finest sausages and a royal pardon for all past and future misdemeanors. The king, impressed by my resilience and unflagging sense of humor, even offered me a position in the royal messenger service, a promotion I gratefully and somewhat nervously accepted. After all, what could possibly go wrong? My newfound reputation, cemented by the ludicrous goose-napping trial, had somehow reached the ears of Ilara, a kitchen maid in the king's employ. Ilara wasn't your typical scullery wench. She possessed a sharp wit that could cut through butter like a hot knife, an encyclopedic knowledge of royal gossip, and a pair of eyes that missed nothing. Her hair, a riot of fiery red curls, escaping a perpetually askew cap, framed a face that was perpetually dusted with flour, yet somehow managed to maintain an air of mischievous intelligence. She wasn't just quick with a clever retort, she was alarmingly quick with a cleaver, a skill she'd honed while dealing with unruly cooks and overripe vegetables. Our first encounter was less than auspicious. I'd been summoned to the royal kitchen, not for a celebratory feast this time, but rather for a rather more disconcerting interrogation. The king's spies, it turned out, hadn't completely solved the mystery of the suspect's sausages. While the butcher and chef had confessed to their plot, several key questions remained unanswered. It was Ilara who spotted me, a figure lost amongst the towering copper pots and the heady aroma of roasting meats. Her initial reaction was a mixture of suspicion and amusement. "Well, well," she declared, wiping flour from her apron with a flourish. "If it isn't the hero of the goose-napping saga, come to sample the king's latest culinary masterpiece." Her tone implied that the masterpiece was far from edible. I explained my predicament, detailing the unsolved aspects of the sausage conspiracy. She listened, her expression shifting from amusement to shrewd calculation. "So," she said, her eyes gleaming with a sudden insight, "they replaced the sausages, but with what and why?" Her insightful questions revealed a gap in the investigation. The confessed butchers hadn't revealed the origin of the replacement sausages, nor the reason behind the entire ridiculous plot. Ilara, however, wasn't satisfied with half answers. She possessed a detailed knowledge of the royal kitchen's suppliers, their respective reputations, and even their preferred methods of sausage preparation. She explained that certain butchers used specific spices. A certain blend identified the true supplier, a shady character known only as Fingers, who operated a clandestine butcher shop in the city's less savory districts. Fingers, she explained, her voice low, doesn't deal in ordinary pork. His meats, let's just say they're acquired less than ethically. Her eyes widened slightly, adding, I once saw him bargaining with a group of rather unsavory characters who seemed rather fond of strange pets. Her words sparked a chill down my spine. The king's favorite sausages. Could they have been made from something far more unsettling? The sheer horror of the thought, the king potentially consuming sausages made from exotic ingredients, propelled my investigation forward. I needed to find Finger's shop. Finding Finger's shop proved to be a perilous undertaking. It was nestled in a labyrinthine network of alleyways that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. The air hung heavy with the stench of stale ale, unwashed bodies, and questionable meats. Ilara, surprisingly, proved to be the perfect guide. She moved through the shadows with the grace of a phantom, her knowledge of the city's underbelly astonishing. She knew the secrets of every tavern, the gossip of every alley, and the habits of every rat. It was a terrifying but strangely captivating experience. We eventually discovered Finger's shop, a dimly lit establishment with a single, ominous-looking door. The sounds emanating from within hinted at a far more substantial enterprise than simple sausage making. Ilara, armed with a small but surprisingly effective pepper grinder, held the rear, while I, armed with my wits and a very rusty sword, approached the door. The shop itself was a testament to questionable hygiene and questionable practices. Hams hung from the ceiling alongside bizarre, unidentifiable animal carcasses, which were being butchered on questionable equipment. The air reeked of something vaguely equine. Fingers, a burly man with surprisingly nimble fingers, was discovered amidst a mountain of suspicious ingredients, humming happily to himself as he stuffed sausages. Confrontation wasn't needed. A series of strategic sneezes from Alara, strategically directed towards Fingers, provided just enough chaos and distraction. A very well-placed pepper grinder shot resulted in Fingers covering his eyes, providing me the perfect opportunity to grab a few key ingredients. These provided irrefutable evidence of his nefarious activities. Fingers' confession that involved an elaborate scheme to use dog meat to sabotage royal sausages to make way for his own inferior product concluded our investigation. The evidence we gathered proved that Fingers was not only supplying the butchers with inferior meat, but had been deliberately undermining the king's reputation through culinary sabotage. He'd been using his contacts within the royal kitchen, a network even Ilara didn't know, to further his ambitions. His plan was less about greed and more about pure, unadulterated spite. He believed the king's personal chef was an incompetent fool, and this plot was his way of teaching him a lesson. Returning to the castle, Ilara and I presented our evidence to the king. His initial reaction was one of horror, followed by a burst of uncontrollable laughter. He found the entire situation, particularly the involvement of canine meat, utterly hilarious. Fingers was promptly banished to a remote island to raise his own supply of exotic meats. Ironically, he was quite fond of this punishment. The king, in a gesture of gratitude, offered Ilara a promotion, not to head chef, but to royal sausage taster, a position that, according to Alara, carried a far less dangerous risk than dealing with the kitchen staff. My unexpected alliance with Alara had not only solved the sausage mystery, but had also demonstrated that even in the most chaotic situations, unlikely friendships and unexpected alliances could arise. And I realized that while my job as a messenger was certainly filled with peril and absurdity, it was the unexpected allies and the absurd situations that made it all worthwhile. The next royal decree, I suspected, would be far less mundane. The king, emboldened by his recent near disaster, commissioned a new series of royal sausages with Alara's careful supervision, of course, and I found myself anticipating the next adventure with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. The life of a medieval messenger, it seemed, was anything but dull. The king's laughter, surprisingly hearty, echoed through the great hall, rattling the chandeliers and causing a nearby tapestry depicting a rather improbable battle between a unicorn and a badger to tremble. It wasn't the sort of reaction I'd anticipated after revealing a plot involving dog meat sausages, but then again, nothing about my life as a royal messenger had ever gone according to plan. Ilara, ever the pragmatist, remained unimpressed. "He finds it hilarious," she muttered, wiping a stray bit of flour from her cheek. "I bet he wouldn't be laughing if he'd had to spend the last 3 days navigating Finger's alleyway." She had, of course, a point. The alley, a warren of shadowed passageways reeking of questionable hygiene and even more questionable trades, had tested even her considerable street smarts. I, for one, still had nightmares about the things I'd seen hanging from Finger's ceiling. The king, finally composing himself, wiped a tear from his eye. "Banish Fingers to the Isle of Misfit Meats," he boomed, the decree punctuated by another fit of laughter. "Let him raise his own exotic livestock in peace, and may his sausages never grace my table again." The Isle of Misfit Meats, it turned out, wasn't some mythical land of culinary curiosities. It was a rather bleak, windswept island, more known for its lack of palatable food than its abundance of it. According to Alara, who had a surprisingly detailed knowledge of royal exiles, Fingers had always harbored a secret desire for a life of solitary farming. The king's decree, therefore, was less a punishment and more an oddly specific form of fulfilling a lifelong dream. A darkly comedic twist, even for the bizarre standards of the royal court. My own reward was considerably less glamorous. A meager raise, barely enough to cover the cost of a new pair of boots. My current ones were beyond repair, sporting more holes than a sieve, and a slightly less condescending nod from the king's chief scribe. The scribe, a man whose beard was perpetually entangled in his quill, seemed to consider any messenger who survived more than a week a minor miracle. Justice, as it turned out, was a highly subjective concept in the king's court. It wasn't dispensed evenly or fairly, often hinging on the king's mood, the quality of the wine, and the overall absurdity of the situation. In the case of the dog meat conspiracy, justice had arrived in the form of a bizarre, almost comical exile for Fingers and a minuscule pay raise for me. The aftermath of the sausage scandal had surprisingly elevated Alara's status in the royal kitchen. Her promotion to royal sausage taster wasn't exactly the pinnacle of culinary achievement, but it did come with significantly fewer threats of cleaver-related violence from disgruntled cooks. She was also tasked with overseeing the creation of the new royal sausage recipe, ensuring a complete lack of canine ingredients. This involved a series of taste tests that I accidentally stumbled into on a few occasions. Let's just say that the initial batch was experimental. My life, however, continued its relentless march through the ridiculous. I was dispatched on missions involving increasingly bizarre requests, each one more challenging and often more absurd than the last. One mission involved delivering a love letter penned by the king's youngest and surprisingly well versed in matters of romance, son to a noblewoman notorious for her temper and collection of venomous snakes. Another involved transporting a rare breed of singing frog with an exceptionally high-pitched voice to a royal festival. There was the infamous incident with the runaway peacock, which resulted in a 2-day chase across the countryside, and the time I almost got eaten by a grumpy badger with a penchant for royal mail. Each mission was a testament to the unpredictable and chaotic nature of medieval communication. The sheer inefficiency of the system never ceased to amaze me. Months would pass before messages arrived, often altered beyond recognition or completely lost to the vagaries of weather, bandits, or ravenous wolves. I often considered the irony of spending months delivering a message that could have been transmitted in seconds via a modern text message. My reflection on the ordeal was a mix of profound exhaustion and a grim sort of amusement. The medieval world, with all its hardships, injustices, and bizarre customs, was a place where the absurd was the norm and the extraordinary was merely Tuesday. The life of a royal messenger was certainly not for the faint of heart, nor for the easily offended. It was a career path that demanded a thick skin, a sense of humor, and an unwavering acceptance that things would almost certainly go wrong. Yet, there was a strange sort of satisfaction in the chaos. It was the unlikely alliances, the unexpected victories, however small, and the sheer absurdity of it all that made it, in its own perverse way, rewarding. Ilara, with her quick wit and even quicker reflexes, became an unlikely friend and invaluable ally. The sausages, the geese, the love letters, the runaway peacock, they all blurred into a tapestry of comical misadventures. My journey as a royal messenger taught me one irrefutable truth. Perfect justice was a luxury seldom afforded in the Middle Ages. Instead, there was only a bizarre, often darkly comedic, version of it. But armed with a worn-out pair of boots, a perpetually empty purse, and a newfound appreciation for the absurdity of existence, I trudged onward, ever ready for whatever ridiculous errand awaited me, and perhaps even a little eager for the next hilarious chaos. The king, I suspected, had more surprises up his sleeve, and possibly more questionable sausages. The life of a messenger, after all, was rarely dull, and mine, in particular, seemed to be a never-ending comedic performance, one I could no longer imagine myself living without.